Alrighty, welcome to our next short-ish overview of the next chapter of our book. I first want to offer a quick apology for any confusion that you may have encountered in the first pair of videos. It wasn't until after I recorded the second of those that I realized I had been misnumbering things, and that in her book, Jane Smiley calls the introduction as numbered chapter 1, and then what I was calling chapter 1 is numbered chapter 2, and what I was calling chapter 2 is numbered chapter 3. So we're actually on chapter 4 here in the origins of the novel. And so I'm actually going to begin by just going through quickly, or showing here on screen at least, the timeline of the books and texts that she talks about. And I'm not going to really get too far into the weeds of the very specific things that she has to say about each of those books, because I think they speak very much for themselves. You'll see in the next few slides, I'm gonna highlight more the thinking that she has about novels in general as it relates to the more specific things that she says about each of those particular books. But just to address a couple of things that she does bring up, I think the reason, if I'm trying to read her mind, part of the reason she chooses these particular stories, starting in the 1300s with the Decameron and ending in the late 18th century with Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, is that these really capture kind of where the notion of this long written down story starts. There are certainly other written texts before the Decameron. Some of the oldest long epics are from several thousand years before this. The oldest text that we generally have on record is the Epic of Gilgamesh and some other partial texts and full texts. But she's really thinking about this idea of where she can trace the evolution of the novel as a single unified large work. But of course, one of the things that she discusses is that, the Decameron and the Heptameron really start off, they are more medieval story cycles. And you could add in the Canterbury Tales that some of you might be familiar with. And it's not until Don Quixote, and then especially the move to the Princess of Cleves, where we really see these singular protagonist-oriented narratives. And then the reason she stops at Tristram Shandy is because, well, obviously the content and to certain stylistic degrees form of the novel has obviously changed and transformed since 1795, one would hope. And the concerns that novelists of the 21st century have are certainly going to be very different from those of the late 18th century. That's where the transition into what we think of as the not necessarily contemporary, but the novel, the modern novel, really wraps up. You could certainly trace how the Romantic and Victorian writers of the 19th century, and then the modernists, the postmodernists, and the post-postmodernists of the 20th and into the 21st century have treated and worked through the novel. But I would certainly say that the shift from the 1300s to the late 1700s here was far more significant and bigger than the changes between Tristram Shandy and now. But so that's why that's the timeline that she operates with. So as usual, I'm going to just pluck out some things that I find compelling and valuable to us. I hope that you find this entire chapter, even though it is significantly historically oriented and spends a lot of time dwelling, again, on very particular novels that you may or may not have read or may not be familiar with. Beyond just these very particular things I'm going to talk about, I think just learning about the history of where our art comes from does have significant value and meaning. And so hopefully you find the whole chapter informative, even if you've never read Don Quixote, just thinking about some of the things that are peppered within that discussion of that novel and the others that I think are useful. But I'm going to pluck out just a few things here. So first of all, we think about the origins and tradition of the novel. I think this is worth thinking about this from the very first page of the chapter. Every novel that now strikes us as original itself originated in a social and artistic network of some sort. And this goes back to, there's a saying attributed to the writer John Gardner, that there are only two stories to tell. A person goes on a journey and a stranger comes to town. And I talk to students about the idea that, well, a stranger comes to town sure sounds like a person going on a journey. And so really all novels are all stories are of a person going on a journey. And I think it's worth thinking about this concern that we often have of like trying to write something completely new and original is really impossible. Because, as she says here, every story and every version of every story originates within a context, an artistic network, inspired by other artwork that has been created. And so your goal is not really to tell a brand new story because it's impossible, but to tell the story that you have to tell within the place and time and culture in which you are situated. Um, and a little bit tied to that is this notion of the tradition of the novel is a living legacy from older authors to younger ones. You know, as younger, and younger here doesn't necessarily mean a actual like biological age, but it has to do with those who have written work before you are the older authors from whom you are drawing inspiration, direction, creative impulse, and you are working within a tradition. And you should embrace that you are working within a tradition. Presuming that you took our orientation course, you all created some kind of lineage tree that you think you live within. And I think that's a really valuable exercise because it helps us figure out what that legacy that we are extending is. And so I just think it's worth keeping that in mind anytime you're working on any kind of creative work. I mean, I think this could be said about any of the forms that we write in, but we're talking specifically about novels, and so that's why we're talking about it in those terms. Um, so I'm gonna move relatively broadly and quickly through here because again, much of these sections are kind of an analytical deep dive into some of these texts. But I want to just talk about a couple of things that Jane Smiley talks about. So when we think about the transformations of the novel, I actually find this really interesting, and I'm not directly quoting her here, but she talks about how one of the things that happens in the move from the Decameron to the Heptameron and then into Don Quixote is this transformation from what I refer to as the medieval story cycle to the modern novel of a single story. Now, single story, I mean in very flexible terms, because you will certainly see novels that tell multiple stories within one larger narrative. But what's interesting to me about this is one of my favorite current forms is the short story collection that is also kind of a novel. And so we're in this kind of cultural loop, this historical loop, where we're seeing some novelists, writers, short story writers, kind of reclaiming that idea of the medieval story cycle to a certain extent, where you have these stories that are connected to each other in some capacity, but not in the way that a traditional novelistic narrative operates. Now, obviously, this is a little different from these medieval story cycles if you are familiar with them at all. And as she talks about, we get stories that are completely cut off from one another. Maybe a core group of characters, like in the Decameron, are telling these disparate stories, but there is still this link to that ancient form, not ancient, that medieval form that we're seeing here. And then one of the most important things that she talks about in terms of the contemporary modern novel as we know it, on page 66, she talks about what Marguerite and her interlocutors are doing in the Heptameron is experimenting with realism and psychology, two essential characteristics of the novel. Now, this is maybe one of the few times I'm going to beef with Jane Smiley's lexicon here. I don't think she actually means realism in terms of like the distinction between literary realism and fantasy. I think what she means is the believability of character action based on the circumstances they're in and the psychology of those characters. I actually make a distinction between the notion of believability and realism. Realism you can do without, believability you cannot. We have to trust and buy into the things that characters do based on the circumstances they're in and who they are. And that's what I think she means here, that there's this movement toward us thinking about, who these people are and why we should believe they would behave the ways they believe. Because in her next sentence, she says, whether or not the stories they tell are true, in their critiques, they treat them as if they were. They discuss motivations, social context, and states of mind before, during, and after the action. That to me speaks to the believability of things. Why did this character do this? They did it because of this. They felt this pressure, this desire, this want. And you can do that in realism or fantasy or science fiction or whatever you want. And so I just wanted to point out that's my one of the very few times I will suggest an alternate way of thinking about what she has to say. Anyway, and then on the next page, she talks about strangeness. And this is what I think supports my read of that. What she means is believability. She's talking about crime and punishment. and some other stories here. Sensational acts arouse moral curiosity. Onlookers become preoccupied with finding a logic for them that allows them to fit into some theory or other of human nature. And I starred this the first time I read it because this is where we get to that sense of believability. You know, the sensational the sensational nature of something is fine. You can give me any bizarre kind of premise or world that you want, as long as there is a logical underpinning to it, and as long as it's trying to speak to, here we get that theory word again, and that idea of human nature, right? We're always coming back to, I as the writer am hypothesizing something about human beings. No matter what weird circumstances I'm using, even if I'm not using actual human beings, I am still making an assertion about the human experience. And so I think that's what she means here when she talks about this notion of sensational acts. And then the last thing on this particular slide, and near the top of page 68, she talks about the novel organizes itself around individuals and pays attention to the inner life and its relationship to the outer life. And I think this is just a really important thing for us to remember as we're writing. We don't have to know this from the outset. We don't have to have the sense of how the inner life and the outer life work together, but we need to be thinking about making them work together. What are the ways in which someone's external experience, the plot, the conflicts, are related to their inner selves, the characterization, the significance of these events to them, the thematic things that we're trying to aim for. Because I think sometimes we can lose one or the other as we are working through the stories that we're trying to tell. So just keeping that in mind. And then just a series of things that throughout the rest of this chapter, I think she is talking about in terms of the power and the function of novels. So a couple things, broadly speaking, on page 69, she says, this is the essential process and power of the novel, to make one cohesive work of art out of many disparate elements. And I think that's ultimately what we are trying to do is, we bring together all of these things. Like we said, the external circumstances, the external environment, the external conflict, the internal self, the emotional states, the internal conflict, all of these pieces of the puzzle eventually have to fit together in a single cohesive way. And we don't need to know what that looks like from the get-go, but we need to be thinking about how to make it all fit together in some capacity by the time we're finished. And then this is in the context of her talking about Daniel Defoe's work on page 76. I'm leaping ahead a little bit. Moral ambiguity perfectly suits both the novel's focus on the inner life and also the tendency of prose to proliferate, making finer and finer distinctions at greater and greater length. So what I just want to touch on a couple things here is I think moral ambiguity is really a valuable thing for us to think about. This doesn't mean that we can't have good guys and bad guys in the things that we write, but we should be thinking about how are our good guys making bad decisions? How are they flawed? How are our bad guys understandable? And can we empathize with them? Can we see why they're motivated by something? And then also this idea of proliferation, right? That as our work grows in terms of length, we are exploring those finer and finer questions as we go. So a character might appear to be wholly bad from the start, but then we, as the writer, we want to start getting ourselves and our readers thinking about, well, what are the moral complications and compunctions of what's going on here? And that's one of the great things about the lengthy nature of the novel, is we can really dig into that moral ambiguity, those difficult questions. And then two other things, the last two things from this chapter, I'm pointing out this question from her discussion of Samuel Richardson's Pamela. The basic question Pamela, the character, asks is, do I belong to my master or do I belong to God? Not because I have much to say about this specific question, but to link this back to this idea of the theory of a novel, the hypothesis and the question, right? This idea that there is something that the writer is trying to hypothesize, think about, explore, and go through, right? And so every book, every writer of every book should be able to articulate what the basic question is and what the hypothesis as it relates to that is. And then the last thing that I just want to bring up is what she says on the very last page here. In any novel, what is most original is always what is most intimate. And so this loops all the way back to what I said at the beginning of this video about the notion of, we have no new stories to tell. We only have our version to tell. And one of the ways that we create those original, quote unquote, new versions is by drilling down into the intimate specifics of the story we're telling. Why are you, as a writer, as an individual writer, the right person at the right time to be telling this particular story about this particular character or set of characters? And what is it that we can know with as much specificity and complexion about these characters in order to really discover something original? So I would just be thinking about that, because the great novels that we have are the ones that really do this in that very intimate and specific way. Okay, those are my thoughts on this chapter. As usual, I look forward to seeing what it is that you think of it.